My only son came and handed me an envelope. Inside was enough money to tell me, "Mother, disappear." I spent my whole life building this farm. I buried my husband on this land. I raised my son on this very land. And then one October afternoon, that son walked into my house with a stack of forged papers in his hand, and the smile of someone who had planned this for a long time. If you think you've ever been betrayed, sit down. Because my story is heavier than anything you can imagine. Like, comment the city you're viewing so I know how far my story has come. And watch to the end, because the ending will surprise you. The thing about betrayal is that it never announces itself. It doesn't knock on your front door wearing a sign around its neck. It doesn't send you a warning in the mail or whisper in your ear the night before it arrives. No, betrayal wears a familiar face. It uses a voice you've heard your whole life. It walks through a door you've opened 1,000 times without a second thought. And by the time you realize what's standing in your living room, it's already too late to pretend you didn't let it in. My name is Margaret Hayes. I'm 67 years old. And I'm telling you right now, the worst day of my life didn't happen when my husband died. It didn't happen when the drought took half our crops 2 summers in a row. It didn't happen when the doctor found a shadow on my chest x-ray that turned out, thankfully, to be nothing. The worst day of my life happened on a Tuesday in October, when my only son drove up the gravel road to Silver Creek Ranch, the land his father and I had bled and sweated over for 4 decades, and handed me an envelope of cash like I was some stranger he was trying to buy off. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened, every word of it. And I want you to understand something before I begin. I am not a perfect woman. I have made mistakes. I have been stubborn when I should have been soft, and I have been soft when I should have been hard as stone. But I have never once stopped loving my son, not for a single day in 65 years of his life. That's what made it so devastating. That's what made it something I still can't fully explain, even now. Chad. Silver Creek Ranch sits on 412 acres of Montana land that my late husband, Robert Hayes, purchased when he was 29 years old with money he'd saved working double shifts at a machine shop for 7 years straight. He used to say the land cost him 7 years of his youth, and he'd pay that price again without hesitating once. When I first saw it, a young woman of 22, newly married, standing at the top of the first ridge looking down at the creek winding through the valley below, I cried. I don't know why exactly. Something about it felt ancient and quiet, and already ours in a way I couldn't put into words. Robert put his arm around my shoulders and said, "This is where we're going to grow old, Maggie." And we did. We raised cattle and planted hay and fixed fences in winter storms when the temperature dropped so low that the metal gate latches burned your bare hands. We built the main house addition ourselves over 2 summers. Robert and his brother Earl, and 2 men from town who worked for meals and fair wages. We had Daniel when I was 24, and he grew up running through those fields like the land itself was his personal kingdom, which, in every way that mattered, it was. Robert died 11 years ago. A heart attack, sudden and merciless, on a January morning while he was walking from the barn to the house. He was 59 years old. I found him in the snow with his boots still on, and I sat with him for a long time before I could make myself go inside and call anyone. I just sat with him in the cold and held his hand and talked to him like he could still hear me, because I wasn't ready to stop talking to him yet. After Robert passed, I ran the ranch alone. Not easily. Not without days when I thought I genuinely could not do it. Days when the physical exhaustion and the loneliness and the weight of every decision landing on one set of shoulders felt like more than any human being was built to carry. But I did it. I hired good help when I could afford it. I made hard calls about the herd and the leases. I kept the books myself because I'd always kept the books, even when Robert was alive, because he was better with a wrench than a spreadsheet, and we both knew it. Daniel helped some in the early years. He'd come out on weekends and school breaks when his daughter Olivia was young, and those were good times. Genuinely good times that I held on to later, like photographs of a person you've lost. He and I weren't always easy with each other, but whose family is? We had our friction. He had opinions about how the ranch should be run. I had the deed in my name and the experience of 40 years behind me, so I listened to his opinions and then did what I thought was right, which did not always sit well with him. But I told myself that was just the ordinary tension of a mother and adult son trying to figure out how to exist in each other's lives without old patterns pulling everything back to childhood. I told myself a lot of things. Looking back, I told myself his phone calls getting shorter was just business stress. I told myself his visits spacing out over the years was just the natural drift of a man with his own life, his own family, his own problems to manage. I told myself the vague discomfort I sometimes felt when his name showed up on my phone was just anxiety, just my own loneliness talking, just the paranoia of an old woman living alone on a big piece of land. I was wrong about all of it. The first sign that something was genuinely wrong came about 14 months before everything collapsed. My neighbor and old friend, Pete Gallagher, stopped by one afternoon with a peculiar expression on his face, the kind a man wears when he's carrying news he doesn't want to deliver. Pete was in his early 70s, a rancher himself, someone who'd known Robert since before I came into the picture. He sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold between his hands, and he said, "Maggie, I don't know if this means anything, but I heard something in town yesterday that sat wrong with me." "Then you better tell me," I said. He told me that a man from a development company out of Billings had been asking around about Silver Creek Ranch, asking who owned it, what the tax situation looked like, whether there were any pending liens, whether the owner might be open to selling. And this man, apparently, had mentioned in passing that he'd already been in contact with the family. "The family," I said slowly. That's what Jerry at the feed store said he told him. The family. Like it was already a done deal being worked out in private. I thanked Pete and walked him to his truck and stood on the porch watching him drive down the long gravel road until I couldn't see the dust anymore. Then I went inside and sat very still at that same kitchen table for a long time. I was not panicking. That's important to understand. I was 66 years old, and I had been through enough in my life to know that panic is the least useful thing a person can do when the ground shifts beneath their feet. What I was doing, quietly, carefully, with the same methodical attention I'd given to every serious problem for 40 years, was thinking. And what I thought was this. My son has been talking to developers about this ranch, without telling me, without asking me, without even hinting that such a conversation had taken place. That was not an accusation, not yet. It was just a fact I was sitting with, turning it over in my hands like a stone, feeling its weight and its edges. Over the next several weeks, I started paying closer attention to things I'd been too trusting to notice before. Small things, at first. A property records search that showed someone, I couldn't tell who yet, had requested copies of the original deed and survey maps from the county office. A phone call from my bank flagging an unusual inquiry on the account that held the ranch's operating funds. Someone had called asking about account balances and transfer procedures, representing themselves as a family member. When the bank teller had asked for a callback number, the person had hung up. Then I found something that made my hands go cold. I had a habit of filing important documents in a locked drawer in the office off the main hallway. Robert's old roll-top desk, a piece of furniture I'd never gotten rid of because I couldn't imagine the room without it. One afternoon, I opened the drawer to retrieve an old lease agreement, and I noticed immediately, with the particular precision of someone who has maintained the same filing system for 30 years, that several documents had been moved. Not taken, moved. As if someone had gone through them carefully and tried to put everything back exactly as they'd found it, not quite succeeding. The original deed was still there, but it had been placed back upside down. In 30 years of using that filing system, I had never once put a document back upside down. I stood at that desk for a long moment. Then I locked the drawer, put the key in my bra instead of hanging it on the hook where it usually lived, and went to make a phone call. The attorney I called was a woman named Carol Benton, who practiced in Missoula. I'd used her years ago for Robert's estate paperwork, and I'd always respected her because she spoke to me like I was a full adult with a functioning brain, rather than an elderly widow who needed things explained slowly, with small words. I told her what I'd found and what Pete had told me and what the bank had flagged. I told her about the deed being replaced upside down. Carol was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Then she said, "Margaret, how soon can you come in?" "I can be there Thursday." "Come Thursday. And Margaret, don't discuss any of this with Daniel before we've talked. Not a word. That instruction was harder than Carol probably imagined, because the day after I made that call, Daniel phoned me, one of his increasingly rare calls, and he was warm in a way he hadn't been in months, chatty, asking about the ranch, asking how I was feeling, asking about Olivia, who was in her first year of college and had been calling me more regularly than her father had. I answered his questions. I told him the ranch was fine. I said I'd been feeling well. I asked about his business, which was a commercial real estate firm he'd started 8 years ago in Denver, and he said things were good, busy, lots of deals in the pipeline. His voice was easy and unhurried, and while I listened to that voice, the voice I'd heard since it was a newborn's first cry in a hospital room in Bozeman, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel clearly until that moment. I felt afraid. Not of Daniel, exactly, but of what Daniel was capable of becoming if the right pressures were applied to the wrong parts of him. A mother knows things about her child that no one else in the world knows. She knows his weaknesses and his wounds and the specific places where his character is less solid than it appears from the outside. I had always known that Daniel carried a shadow of resentment that he'd never fully dealt with. Something about the ranch, about Robert, about what he felt he'd been owed and never received. I'd sensed it for years without being able to name it precisely. Now, sitting on my front porch listening to my son's easy voice, I thought I was beginning to name it. Mess. Carol Benton confirmed my worst fears and then raised them. In the 2 weeks between my call and my appointment in Missoula, she had put her own investigator to work, a quiet, methodical man named Frank D'Souza, who had spent 20 years doing financial forensics and document fraud investigation, and who had, within 10 days, found things that Carol said she had to see printed out on paper before she fully believed them herself. I sat across from Carol at her conference table on a Thursday morning in late September, and she laid it out for me piece by piece, and I will tell you, I kept my face still throughout the entire conversation because I am a woman who has learned how to hold herself together in moments when falling apart would be the easiest thing in the world to do. But inside, I was crumbling in a way I hadn't since the morning I sat in the snow next to Robert's body. Here is what Frank D'Souza had found. Daniel had been in contact with a developer called Meridian Land Group for almost 2 years. The initial conversations had apparently been exploratory, just a son making casual inquiries about what his mother's ranch might be worth in the current market. But somewhere along the line, those conversations had become something else. Meridian Land Group had made a formal offer on Silver Creek Ranch for $8.4 million. And Daniel, without my knowledge, without my consent, without even a single conversation about it, had accepted that offer in principle and begun working toward completing the transaction. In order to do that, he had needed documentation showing that he had legal authority over the property. Frank had found evidence of forged documents, not sloppy amateur work. This was professionally done, the kind of forgery that required someone with real skill and almost certainly professional connections. The documents purported to show a property transfer from Robert Hayes to Daniel Hayes executed just before Robert's death, a transfer that, according to these papers, had given Daniel full ownership of Silver Creek Ranch, with Margaret Hayes retaining only a life tenancy that could be terminated under certain conditions of mental incapacity. Mental incapacity. My son had arranged for documents that could be used, if necessary, to have me declared mentally unfit so that I could be removed from my own home. I looked at those papers spread across Carol Benton's conference table, and I didn't cry. I want you to understand that I did not cry. I felt something much quieter than tears. I felt the particular cold stillness of a woman who has just had confirmed what she already knew in her bones, but had hoped against hope was wrong. "What do we do?" I asked. Carol folded her hands on the table. "We build a case. We document everything he's done. We legally secure the property in ways that make the sale impossible to complete. And then, when we're ready, we confront him. And if he's already close to completing the sale, then we move faster than he does." In the weeks that followed, I did things I never imagined I would have to do. I worked with Carol to establish a conservation easement on the majority of Silver Creek Ranch's acreage, a legal protection that would permanently restrict commercial development of the land regardless of who owned it. The process was more complicated than I expected, and required navigating paperwork and county approvals that took time I didn't feel like I had. But Carol was efficient, and Frank D'Souza helped accelerate things by knowing exactly which wheels needed greasing and in what order. I also made a decision about Olivia. My granddaughter was 22 that fall. She was in her first year at Montana State studying environmental science, and she loved this ranch with a purity and fierceness that her father had apparently never felt. When she was small, she used to follow me around the property, asking questions about every plant and animal and feature of the land, and I had loved that about her. The genuine hunger to know and understand things, the way she looked at Silver Creek like it was something worth protecting. I called her on a Sunday evening, and I told her as plainly as I could what was happening. She was silent for a full 30 seconds after I finished. Then she said, "Grandma, how long have you known?" "A few weeks." "I didn't want to tell you until I knew what I was going to do about it." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to protect this place, and I'm going to transfer a portion of the property into your name, if you're willing. It's part of how we make sure that even if your father finds a way to challenge what I'm doing, and he might, there's a piece of this land that's yours outright." Another silence. "Does Dad know you know?" "No, and I need him to keep not knowing until I'm ready." Her voice, when she finally spoke again, had gone very quiet. "He really did this. He really tried to just sell it without telling you." "Yes." "What about you? Where did he think you were going to go?" And that was the question that finally broke through something in my chest. Not the fraud, not the forged documents, not the $8 million sale being arranged behind my back, but the simple human question of where did he think I was going to go? Because embedded in my son's plan, laid out in those documents on Carol Benton's conference table, was an answer to that question. He'd arranged a room for me. A nice room, the brochures showed, private facility about 90 miles from Silver Creek, activities and meal service, and a small garden. A very pretty brochure for a place where you put someone when you want them to disappear politely. He had literally looked at brochures. "Olivia," I said, when I could trust my voice again, "I need you to stay at school and act normal until I tell you otherwise. Can you do that?" "Yes," she said. "But Grandma, I'm with you. Whatever you need, I'm with you." I think about those weeks a lot now, the work of those weeks. The late evenings on the phone with Carol, the careful conversations with Frank, the paperwork and the county offices, and the careful documentation of every piece of Daniel's scheme that Frank kept uncovering was exhausting in a specific way that had nothing to do with physical labor. I was building something. I was building a wall brick by brick between Daniel and what he intended to take. And the whole time I was doing it, he was calling me every week with that warm, easy voice, asking how I was doing, and I was answering him. I was answering him normally. Do you know how much discipline that takes? To speak casually with the person who is trying to steal your home and warehouse you in a facility 90 miles away. To say, "Oh, the weather's been nice, a little dry," and "Olivia called last week, she seems to be settling in well," while inside your mind you are watching a man build a scaffold over a pit he intends to drop you into? It takes a kind of discipline I didn't know I had. Frank uncovered one more thing during those weeks, and I want to tell you about it because it mattered. Not just legally, but personally. He found out why Daniel had done this. Daniel's commercial real estate company was in serious trouble. Not cash flow trouble, not a bad quarter trouble. Serious, existential, the kind of trouble that means lawsuits and creditors, and the real possibility of having your professional life dismantled in public. He had made a series of catastrophic investments in the Denver market over the previous 3 years, and the losses had compounded in ways he apparently hadn't seen coming, and now he was looking at obligations he had no way of meeting through any legitimate means. $8.4 million would have saved him. And Silver Creek Ranch, my Silver Creek Ranch, Robert's Silver Creek Ranch, was the only asset large enough to generate that kind of money quickly. I sat with that information for a long time. I wanted to feel something clean and simple about it. I wanted to feel pure anger, because anger is at least straightforward. But what I actually felt was more complicated. I felt grief. I felt a particular kind of grief for the version of my son I had believed in for 65 years, the version that turned out to be less solid than I'd imagined. And beneath the grief, something I am almost ashamed to admit, a small, tired understanding. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But understanding. Because I knew my son. I knew how much he'd always needed to win. I knew how badly he handled failure. I knew the particular terror that must have been eating at him as his business collapsed and the walls closed in, and he looked around for anything that could save him. I understood how a desperate man could talk himself into terrible things. Understanding it didn't make it acceptable. I want to be very clear about that. A mother's ability to understand her child's darkness is not the same as excusing it. But it meant that when the confrontation finally came, and it was coming, it was always coming, I could feel it gathering like a storm on the edge of the horizon, I would walk into it knowing not just what my son had done, but something closer to why. And that knowledge was going to matter. The thing I hadn't fully accounted for was the car. Robert's 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback had lived in the second bay of the equipment barn for as long as I could remember. Robert had bought it before we were married. It was one of the few things that was entirely his before our lives merged. And he'd spent years restoring it by hand, weekend after weekend, ordering parts and teaching himself things he didn't know, and occasionally cursing at a manual until I'd bring him coffee and tell him to take a breath. When he died, I couldn't bring myself to do anything with it. I kept it covered with a canvas tarp, and occasionally I'd go in there and just sit in the driver's seat for a few minutes, which I know sounds strange, but grief does strange things to a person. Frank's investigation turned up a classified listing. Someone, using a shell contact that eventually traced back to Daniel, had listed the Mustang for private sale 3 weeks prior. The listing described it accurately and completely, with photographs that could only have been taken inside our barn. It was priced at $60,000, which was probably under market for a car in that condition, suggesting the seller wanted it gone fast. When I read that report, sitting at Robert's roll-top desk with the file open in front of me, I felt something shift in me that I hadn't felt through all the other revelations. The forged documents had made me cold. The retirement facility brochure had broken something open, but the car made me furious in a way that was almost welcome after weeks of careful, controlled stillness. That car was not a financial asset. That car was my husband. That car was Saturday afternoons and grease-stained hands, and the specific pride of a man making something beautiful out of something broken. My son knew exactly what that car meant, and he had listed it for private sale anyway, photographed inside our barn, priced to move fast, because to him everything on this ranch was just inventory. I called Carol that evening. "How much longer do we need?" I asked. "The easement papers come back from the county next week. The transfer to Olivia is ready to file. We're close." "He has my husband's car listed for sale. He went into the barn and photographed it." A pause. "Margaret, I know," I said. "I'm not doing anything rash. I just want to know how much longer." 10 days, Carol said. "Give me 10 days. I gave her 10 days. And on the 11th day, Daniel drove up my gravel road. I had been expecting him. Not that specific morning, I didn't know his schedule, but I had known for weeks that at some point the timeline of his deal would require him to have a direct conversation with me. Meridian Land Group would need signatures eventually. The retirement facility would need a move-in date. Whatever story he'd constructed to explain the whole thing would need to be delivered face to face. I was standing on the porch when his rental car, he'd flown in, then, came up the road through the dust. I had a cup of coffee in my hand and I was wearing my regular work clothes, and I had made a specific decision that morning about how I was going to hold my face and my body when he arrived. Not aggressive, not cold, just still, the way the land was still before a storm. He got out of the car, and I noticed he'd dressed carefully. Pressed shirt, good boots, the kind of casual confidence he wore when he was walking into a meeting he believed he'd already won. He was smiling as he came up the porch steps. He had Robert's jaw and my eyes, and he was 65 years old, and he was my son, and I loved him in the helpless, involuntary way that mothers love their children, regardless of what those children do. And I hated, in that moment, that I couldn't turn that off. "Hey, Mom," he said. "Daniel," I said. "Didn't tell you I was coming." I know. Thought I'd surprise you." He leaned in and kissed my cheek, and I let him, because I'm a woman who has learned that sometimes you let the performance play out before you say what you have to say. Come inside, I said. Coffee's fresh. We sat at the kitchen table where I had sat with Pete Gallagher 14 months ago, and everything had begun. Daniel looked around the kitchen with a particular expression I recognize now. Not nostalgia, but assessment. The look of a man calculating square footage. He had some small talk ready. He deployed it competently. He asked about the herd, about the winter prep, about whether I'd had the roof on the equipment barn looked at since he'd mentioned a sag in the ridgeline 2 years ago. He was good at this. He always had been. The surface of my son was very smooth. Daniel, I said, when he'd run through most of his prepared material, tell me why you're really here. His expression shifted, just slightly. The smile became something more considered. Can't a man visit his mother without a reason? Of course he can, but you didn't fly in from Denver on a Tuesday to be nice to me. A pause. He set down his coffee cup, and then I watched him make the decision. I could see it happening behind his eyes, the calculation, the moment where he chose to drop the performance and go directly to the version of this conversation he'd been rehearsing. Okay, he said. I want to talk to you about the ranch. All right. I've been thinking for a while now about what makes the most sense for the future, for you, for the property. He was choosing his words carefully, but there was a practiced quality to the care, the careful quality of someone who has said this several times in front of a mirror. You're 67, Mom. Running this place alone is a lot. I worry about you. Do you? I do. And I've been looking at some options. There are some really nice communities, active living communities, they call them now, that are specifically designed for people who want Daniel. My voice was quiet, not angry, just direct. I know about Meridian Land Group. The silence that fell over that kitchen was not like ordinary silence. It was the kind of silence that has weight and temperature. I watched the color leave my son's face over about 3 seconds, and then I watched him try to recover. Watched him reaching for an explanation, an alternative framing, some version of this that could be walked back. I know about the documents, I said. I know about the forged transfer papers. I know about the listing for your father's car. I paused. And I know about the room you picked out for me, the one with the garden. I have the brochure, Daniel. I have all of it. He was very still. Outside, a meadowlark was singing somewhere in the field beyond the window. I could hear the creak in the distance, just barely, the way you can on quiet mornings when the wind is from the right direction. I had heard that creak my entire adult life, and it would be there long after both of us were gone. And I thought of Robert walking from the barn through the snow, and I thought of a young woman of 22 standing on a ridge crying for reasons she couldn't fully name. How? He finally said. His voice had changed completely. The careful, practiced warmth was gone. What was left underneath it was something raw, more frightened, and younger sounding than I'd expected. Because I am not a foolish old woman, I said. I have never been a foolish old woman. And somewhere along the way, you forgot that. He looked at me then, really looked at me, across 43 years of a complicated love, and I saw the exact moment when he understood that the plan he had spent 2 years building had already been dismantled. I sat with that. I let him sit with it. And then I stood up, refilled my coffee, and said, "We have a lot to talk about." That conversation lasted 4 hours. It was not clean. It was not calm. It was not the kind of conversation that happens in movies, where people say exactly the right words and everything resolves in the time it takes a song to play. Daniel cycled through denial and then anger and then something approaching collapse, and I sat across from him and held my ground through all of it, because that land outside the window had taught me about holding ground better than anything else I'd ever learned. At one point, he stood up and his voice went loud in a way it hadn't since he was a teenager, and I told him clearly that he could lower his voice or he could leave, and if he left, our next conversation would be with attorneys present. He sat back down. At another point, he cried. Real tears, not performance. I know the difference. And I did not comfort him because I felt that comforting him in that moment would have been a kind of lie. He had not earned comfort yet. He had barely earned the honesty of what I was telling him. What I told him in that 4 hours was this: the ranch could not be sold. The conservation easement had been filed and approved. The land was permanently protected from commercial development. The forged documents had been fully documented and were in the possession of my attorney, who had been in contact with the county prosecutor's office. The listing for his father's car had been taken down, and the account associated with it had been traced and documented. And a portion of Silver Creek Ranch, 48 acres along the North Ridge, including the cottage that Robert had built as a guest house in the early years, had been transferred into Olivia's name the previous week. "You can't," he started. "It's done," I said. It was a legitimate transfer, properly filed, from a property owner of sound mind and body to her granddaughter. Any attorney you hire will tell you that it is unassailable. He looked destroyed. And I want to tell you something about that, about sitting across from your child and watching them look destroyed, knowing you are the one who delivered the blow, even though the blow was just and necessary and long overdue. It doesn't feel like victory, not even a little bit. It feels like amputation. It feels like the particular grief of love that doesn't stop just because someone has done something unforgivable. "What are you going to do?" he asked, very quietly. "I haven't decided yet," I said, which was the truth. Carol had prepared everything necessary to pursue criminal charges. The evidence was solid, the case was clean, and I had not yet decided whether I was going to pursue it. "Mom, I need you to leave now," I said. "I need you to get in your rental car and go back to wherever you're staying, and I need you to call no one. Not Meridian, not your attorneys, not anyone connected to this deal, until I contact you. Do you understand?" He was quiet for a long time, then he nodded. "And Daniel." I waited until he looked at me. "Your father built this ranch. He gave 40 years of his life to this land and to this family. I have given 45. Olivia loves it the way we did. And you?" I stopped, steadied myself. "I don't know what happened to you, but I intend to find out." He left. I heard his rental car go down the gravel road, and I stood at the kitchen window and watched the dust settle after him. Then I went out to the barn and pulled the canvas tarp back from the 1967 Mustang. And I sat in the driver's seat, and I put my hands on the steering wheel, and I said out loud to an empty barn, to a dead man's memory, to 45 years of everything that land had witnessed, "I've got it, Robert. I've got it." And that was the first day of something I didn't yet have a name for. Not the end of the fight. The fight was far from over. Daniel had months of desperate moves still in him, and I had months of hard decisions still ahead of me. Olivia didn't yet know the full weight of what she'd stepped into. And somewhere under all the betrayal and the fraud and the careful documents and the legal machinery I'd set in motion, somewhere under all of it, a mother and her son still had a reckoning to face that no attorney in the world could prepare them for. But the ranch was safe. For now, the ranch was safe. And I stood up from the driver's seat of Robert's Mustang, covered it back up with the canvas, and walked out into the October light, the long Montana light that turns everything gold in the afternoon. And I breathed in the smell of my land, and I kept going. Because that's what you do. You keep going. The days after Daniel left were quieter than I expected. That's the thing no one tells you about a confrontation like that. You spend so long bracing for the explosion that when it finally happens and the smoke clears, the silence that follows doesn't feel like relief. It feels like the held breath before the next thing. And I had been around long enough to know there was always a next thing. I didn't sleep well those first few nights. I'd lie in the dark listening to the ranch settle around me. The old house creaking in the October wind, the cattle moving in the far pasture, the creek doing what it always did. And I'd run through the conversation with Daniel over and over in my head, checking it for cracks the way you check a fence line after a storm. Had I said too much? Had I shown my full hand too early? Had I given him information he could use to outmaneuver me before Carol and I were completely ready? I kept landing on the same answer. I didn't think so, but I wasn't certain. And uncertainty at 67, when the stakes are your home and the 45 years of your life built into it, is not a comfortable thing to carry around. Carol called me the morning after Daniel left. I'd already phoned her the previous evening to tell her the conversation had happened, that he knew, we knew, that he'd left without making any direct threats, but also without making any promises. "He'll call his attorney today," she said. "Probably already has." I figured. They're going to look for any angle they can find. Any procedural gap in the easement filing, any argument against the transfer to Olivia, anything. Expect a letter within the week. Let them look, I said. Carol paused. Margaret, I know you've held up through all of this better than most people would, but I want to ask you directly, are you all right? I thought about that for a moment, genuinely thought about it. Instead of giving her the reflexive answer of fine, I'm fine that I'd been giving people my entire adult life. I'm angry, I said finally, and I'm sad, and I'm tired, but I'm not broken. Does that count as all right? In my experience, Carol said, that's about as all right as anyone in your position gets. Olivia arrived on a Friday. She hadn't asked permission. She'd called Thursday evening and said she was coming, that she'd cleared it with her professors, that there was no version of the world in which she was going to sit in a dorm room in Bozeman while her grandmother was going through this alone. I started to tell her she didn't need to do that, and she said, Grandma, I'm coming. I'll be there by noon. She was there by 11:45. I was standing on the porch when her truck came up the road, the same old blue Ford pickup she'd driven since high school, held together by optimism and an excellent mechanic in town named Dale. And when she got out, she was wearing her work boots and a flannel that had belonged to Robert, which she'd found in a closet years ago and claimed without ceremony. And something about the sight of her in that shirt on this land in that October light made me have to work harder than I'd worked in a while to keep my composure. She came up the porch steps and hugged me and didn't say anything for a moment, just held on, and I let her, because sometimes being held is the thing you need most, even when you've spent 3 weeks convincing yourself you don't need anything. You okay? She finally said, pulling back to look at me. Getting there. She searched my face for a moment with those direct, serious eyes she'd had since she was 3 years old. He really tried to sell it. He got further than trying, I said. He had a signed agreement in principle and a moving date picked out for me. Her jaw tightened. She turned and looked out at the land, the way it rolled down from the house to the creek, the tree line along the north ridge, the equipment barn sitting solid and weathered in the middle distance. She looked at it the way someone looks at a thing they nearly lost. Then she turned back. Show me everything, she said. I want to understand all of it. So I did. We sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours, and I walked her through every document Frank D'Souza had found and every step Carol had taken, and Olivia asked precise, intelligent questions the whole way through. Not emotional questions, not how could he questions, but strategic ones. What was the exact legal status of the conservation easement? What was the timeline for the property transfer to clear? What were the potential vulnerabilities in our position? She had a legal pad in front of her, and she took notes. And watching her do that, watching my granddaughter sit in my kitchen and bring her whole focused mind to bear on protecting this place, was one of the better moments I'd had in a long time. When we'd been through it all, she put down her pen and looked at the legal pad for a moment. He photographed the Mustang, she said. It wasn't a question. He did. In the barn. Frank found the listing. It's been taken down, but he captured it first. She was quiet for a moment. Something moved across her face that I recognized because I'd felt it myself. That specific fury that comes not from the largest betrayal, but from the detail that makes the largest betrayal personal. For me, it had been the brochure for the retirement facility. For Olivia, I could see it was the car, the thing that had been her grandfather's in a way nothing else still was. He knew what that car meant, she said. Yes. He's always known. I didn't say anything to that. It didn't need a response. What I hadn't fully anticipated was what it would do to me to have Olivia there. Not just strategically, but in the basic human sense of not being alone in a house that had been getting very large and very quiet for 11 years. She wasn't easy company, exactly. She was 22 and strong-willed and had opinions about things she was willing to argue about. And she had her mother's habit of reorganizing whatever kitchen she found herself in, which meant I spent the first 2 days finding things in unfamiliar places. She played music in the mornings that was not to my taste. She stayed up later than I did, and the light under her door at midnight was something I had to actively choose not to find irritating. But she was there. And there, I was discovering, mattered more than I'd been admitting to myself. We worked the ranch together during those weeks, and I watched her fall into the rhythms of it with an ease that surprised even her, I think. She knew more than she realized. She'd absorbed things during all those childhood visits without being fully aware of it, the way children absorb language, through proximity and repetition and love. She was good with the cattle in a patient, unhurried way that reminded me of Robert, and she learned the quirks of the equipment without complaint. And she fixed 3 sections of fence along the east pasture with a steadiness and competence that made Dale, who had come to help, raise his eyebrows at me over her head in a way that meant he was impressed and didn't know how to say it. "She's a natural," he told me that evening while Olivia was washing up. "She doesn't know it yet," I said. "Best time to be one," he said, "before you realize how much work it is." Those days had a fragile, suspended quality to them. Good in the way that things are good when you know they exist inside a larger storm that hasn't fully broken yet, because the storm was still coming. Carol's prediction had been accurate. A letter had arrived from a Denver law firm representing Daniel, 4 pages of densely worded legal positioning that essentially claimed the conservation easement had been filed fraudulently and that the transfer of property to Olivia constituted an improper alienation of assets. The letter also included, buried in the 3rd page, a thinly veiled suggestion that if I was pursuing this course of action, it might be worth having an independent assessment of my cognitive state. That last part. Let me sit with that for a moment. My son's attorneys were suggesting, on paper, that I might not be mentally fit to make decisions about my own property. Carol called it a tactical maneuver, a standard play to create doubt and generate delays. She said we'd seen it coming and were prepared for it and that I should not take it personally. I told her that suggesting a 67-year-old woman is mentally incompetent in order to steal her property was in fact something I was taking personally. "Fair enough," she said, "but don't let it make you reactive. That's what it's designed to do." I breathed. What do we do? We respond through proper channels and we do not engage emotionally. We also get a cognitive evaluation from your doctor on record immediately. Not because there's any question, but because we want that ammunition ready before they try to use that angle in court. I made the appointment with my doctor the next morning. I want to tell you that I found it humiliating. Sitting in a medical office answering questions designed to establish that I could remember what year it was and the name of the current president and repeat a sequence of 5 words back in the correct order. I am a woman who has managed a 400-acre ranch through drought and death and a decade of solitude. The indignity of having my competence questioned was one of the sharpest edges of everything Daniel had set in motion. I passed every measure, obviously. Dr. Callie Reeves, who had been my doctor for 14 years, wrote up the evaluation with an efficiency that suggested she, too, found the entire thing offensive. She handed me the completed forms across her desk and said, "For what it's worth, Margaret, I've had patients 30 years younger than you who couldn't come close." "Thank you, Callie. Is there anything else going on? Stress? Sleep?" "Both," I said, "but manageable." She looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has known you long enough to decide whether you're telling the truth. "Call me if it stops being manageable." "I will." I would not call her, but I appreciated the offer. Daniel called on a Wednesday evening, 11 days after he'd driven away from the ranch. I almost didn't pick up. I stood there looking at his name on the screen through 3 full rings, and then I picked up because I had decided early in all of this that I would not be a woman who hid from her own son, no matter what he had done. "Mom." His voice was different from the practiced warmth of the kitchen visit. It was tighter. The veneer was gone, and what was underneath was not particularly pleasant, but it was at least real. "My attorney sent a letter. I received it. I want you to understand, it's not a personal attack, it's just, that's how these things have to work when there are legal complications. They advise certain language and, Daniel," I kept my voice even, "the letter your attorney sent suggests I may not be mentally competent to manage my own affairs. There is no framing of that which is not a personal attack." Silence. "I need you to drop it," I said. "The challenge to the easement, the argument against Olivia's transfer, and particularly that language about cognitive assessment. Drop all of it. Because if you continue down that road, I will stop having any conversation about alternatives to prosecution, and I will let Carol proceed with what she's prepared." More silence. Longer this time. "You'd really do that," he said finally. Not quite a question. I would rather not. I don't want to see you in a courtroom any more than you want to be there, but I will not allow my own son to have me declared incompetent in order to sell the land I've spent my entire life building. I will fight that with everything I have. Do you understand me? I heard him breathing on the other end. I heard something shift in that breathing, something that sounded, if I was reading it right across a phone connection, like a man hitting the bottom of something. Yeah, he said quietly. I understand. Good. I'm going to call you again in a few days. I need time to think about what I want to say to you. I ended the call. My hands were not shaking. I noticed that specifically. I checked for it because I'd been checking myself throughout all of this for signs that the stress was accumulating somewhere in my body in ways I wasn't fully tracking. My hands were steady. My heartbeat was elevated, but not alarmingly so. Olivia was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open. She'd heard enough of my side of the conversation to know what had happened. She looked at me when I came back into the room. He backed down? I think so, for now. She studied me. You okay? Ask me something I haven't already answered today, I said, and she almost smiled. What happened in the next 10 days was quieter and in some ways harder than everything that had come before. Because in those 10 days, while Carol confirmed that Daniel's attorneys had withdrawn the most aggressive elements of their letter and that no court filings had been initiated, I had to decide what I actually wanted. That sounds simple. It wasn't. I lay in bed at night and I thought about my son as a boy, about the specific child he'd been, not the idealized version that grief and love construct over time, but the actual child. He'd been difficult sometimes, stubborn and prone to grievance in ways I'd sometimes addressed well and sometimes handled badly. He'd had a chip on his shoulder about the ranch even as a teenager, a sense that it took his parents' attention and energy in ways that left less for him. I'd known that, and I hadn't always known how to fix it, and some days I'd been too tired to try as hard as I should have. I was not absolving him. I want to be clear about that. What he'd done was a choice made by a grown man with full knowledge of what he was doing and who he was doing it to. But I was a mother sitting alone in the dark on a ranch her son had tried to steal, and I was trying to understand the full shape of the thing I was holding, not just the crime of it, but the human history underneath it. Frank D'Souza sent me his final financial report on Daniel's company during that period. The numbers were worse than I'd initially understood. Daniel wasn't facing a difficult year. He was facing complete dissolution. The debt load, the pending lawsuits from former partners, the collapsed deals. There was no version of it that ended without Daniel losing everything he'd built in Denver. The $8 million from the ranch sale would have bought him time, but Frank's rad was that it probably wouldn't have been enough even then. The hole was too deep. I thought about what it must have been like to be Daniel Hayes 18 months ago, watching his professional life dismantle itself in real time, and looking at the one asset large enough to matter, the ranch he'd grown up resenting, the land he'd always felt stood between him and something he couldn't name, the property his mother had held on to and run and refused to hand over or discuss or treat as anything other than what it was, her life's work, her husband's legacy, her granddaughter's inheritance. I thought about all of that, and then I thought about what I owed him and what I didn't. There's a difference between understanding why someone did something and deciding that understanding entitles them to a consequence they haven't earned. That line, between compassion and accountability, is one of the most important lines a person can learn to hold. I had held it imperfectly at various points in my life. I intended to hold it better now. Olivia found me in this barn on a Sunday afternoon. I was sitting on a hay bale near the Mustang, not doing anything in particular, just being in the space and thinking. She didn't say anything when she came in. She just sat down on a bale on the other side of the car and looked at the canvas cover for a while. Tell me something about Grandpa in this car, she said eventually. So I told her about the summer Robert spent chasing down a replacement carburetor from a shop in Spokane because the original had cracked and the part wasn't made anymore. About the 4 phone calls and the 3 dead ends and the 4th shop owner who turned out to have one in a box in the back that he'd been holding for 30 years because he liked old Mustangs and couldn't bring himself to part with it. About how Robert drove to Spokane himself to pick it up, 8 hours round trip, because he didn't trust shipping for something that had been that hard to find. About the evening, he'd finally gotten it installed, and the engine had turned over, and he'd come inside with grease on his face and a look of pure satisfaction that I'd only ever seen him wear a handful of times. Olivia listened to the whole thing. Then she said, "Dad knew all of that." "He was there for some of it," I said. "He was about 15 when the carburetor thing happened. He came out to the barn when your grandfather finally got it running, and Robert tried to explain what he'd done to fix it. Daniel wasn't really interested, but he was there." "And he still listed it?" "Yes." She was quiet. Outside, I could hear the October wind moving through the dry grass, and the cattle somewhere in the south pasture, and all the ordinary sounds of a place that had been alive and working for 40 years and would keep being alive and working long after both of us were in the ground. "Grandma," she said, "whatever you decide about him, about what happens next, I'm with you. I want you to know that whatever you decide, I'll support it. Even if I decide to give him a chance," she looked at me steadily, "even then, because I trust your judgment and because I know you're not deciding out of weakness." That hit me somewhere deep and unexpected, because she was right that that was the thing I'd been fighting against. The assumption that mercy, if I chose it, would be the same thing as weakness. The world has a tendency to conflate the two, especially when it comes to women, and especially when it comes to mothers who are expected either to forgive everything immediately and without condition, or to cut their children off entirely and be done with it, as if those are the only two options a human being gets. I was working on the third option. I just wasn't sure yet what it looked like. Imets. Carol called me on a Thursday morning with the news I'd been both waiting for and dreading. Daniel's largest creditor, a private equity firm out of Chicago, had filed suit against his company. The news had made a local business publication in Denver. His company's office lease had not been renewed. 2 of his 3 remaining employees had left in the past month. "It's collapsing publicly now," Carol said, which means the pressure on him just increased significantly. People who are cornered sometimes make desperate decisions. "Or sometimes they finally stop running," I said. Carol was quiet for a moment. "Margaret, are you thinking about offering him something?" I looked out the window at the North Ridge, the 48 acres that now legally belonged to Olivia. The old cottage up there that Robert had built in the second summer, that had sat empty for years because there was never a particular occasion to use it. "I'm thinking," I said carefully, "that there are different ways this ends, and I am trying to choose the one that I can live with when I'm 80, not the one that feels most satisfying right now." "That's a harder calculation than it sounds." "I know it is," I said. "I've been doing it for 3 weeks. After I hung up with Carol, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The afternoon light was coming through the west window, and the coffee in my mug had gone cold while I wasn't paying attention. And somewhere in the middle distance, Olivia was out on the fence line doing work that needed doing without anyone having to ask her, and the ranch was still here, still standing, still breathing the way it had always breathed. I picked up my phone and I called my son. He answered on the first ring, which told me he'd been waiting for it. "Daniel," I said, "I want you to come back to the ranch. Not with attorneys, not with any agenda. Just come. And this time, I need you to actually talk to me. Not the version of talking you did last time, where you had your lines prepared. I mean, actually talk." A long pause on the other end, long enough that I wondered whether I'd miscalculated. Then he said quietly, "When?" "This weekend," I said. "Saturday." Another pause. "Olivia's there?" "Yes. She hates me right now." "She has reasons to," I said. "Come anyway." I heard him exhale. A slow, tired, not quite steady sound that was the most honest thing I'd heard from my son in years. "Okay," he said. "Saturday." I put the phone down. I sat with the cold coffee and the slanted light and the sound of the wind, and I thought about Saturday, about what it might mean and what it might cost and what it might, against all odds and without any promises, begin. I was not optimistic. I am not a woman built for optimism. I am built for pragmatism and endurance and the particular stubbornness of someone who has survived enough to know that most things don't resolve cleanly. But I was also not without hope. There is a difference, a significant one, and I held that difference in my hands like a coal, warm enough to matter, careful not to close my fist around it, because some things you have to carry open-palmed or you'll burn yourself. Saturday was coming, my son was coming, and Silver Creek Ranch stood exactly where it had always stood, patient and scarred and rooted and real. Whatever happened next would happen here, on this land. That much, at least, I had made certain of. Saturday came in cold and gray, the kind of October morning that doesn't apologize for itself. I was up before 5, the way I always am when I can't sleep, and have stopped pretending I'm going to. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the darkness thin out over the eastern ridge, and I thought about what I'd said to Daniel on the phone, come, and this time actually talk to me, and I wondered whether I'd been naive to believe he was capable of it. I wondered that seriously without flinching from the answer, because I had learned in the past several weeks that flinching from hard questions was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. Olivia came downstairs at 6:30, surprised to find me already on my second cup. "You sleep at all?" she asked, going for the coffee. "Some." She leaned against the counter and looked at me. She had Robert's habit of assessing a situation before she spoke into it. That particular stillness that most people mistake for shyness, but is actually something closer to discipline. "You're second-guessing calling him," she said. "I'm not second-guessing it. I'm just holding it carefully." "There's a difference?" "There is," I said. Second-guessing means you're thinking about reversing the decision. Holding it carefully means you've made the decision and you're being honest about what it costs. She thought about that for a moment. Then she poured her coffee and sat down across from me and said, "What do you need me to do today?" "I need you to be honest, not cruel. I'm not asking you to perform forgiveness you don't feel, because neither of us has any business performing forgiveness right now. But honest. If he says something that's true, let it be true. If he says something that's a lie, say so. Can you do that?" "Yeah," she said. "I can do that." We sat with our coffee in the quiet kitchen while the light came up outside, and neither of us said much else, because there wasn't much else to say. The conversation that mattered was still hours away. Daniel arrived at 11. Not a rental car this time. He'd driven from wherever he'd been staying, which turned out to be a motel in Missoula, because the expense of flights and hotels was no longer something he could absorb without thinking about it. That detail hit me in a specific way when he mentioned it later. Not with satisfaction. I want to be clear about that, because I'm not a woman who takes pleasure in her child's suffering, even when that suffering is the consequence of choices he made. But it landed. It made him real in a way that the composed, well-dressed man who'd sat at my kitchen table 3 weeks ago had not quite been. He looked different. Not dramatically. He was still Daniel, still carried himself with the posture of a man accustomed to moving through professional spaces with authority, but there was something underneath that posture that had shifted. An exhaustion that wasn't just physical, the kind that comes from weeks of running a calculation that keeps coming up the same wrong answer. Olivia was on the porch when he pulled in. She watched him get out of the car, and she didn't move toward him, and she didn't speak first. She just stood there with her arms at her sides and her face exactly as honest as I'd asked it to be. Daniel looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Olivia." "Dad," she said, not warm, not cruel, just the word. He came up the steps and I opened the door and we went inside, and this time there was no prepared small talk, no careful warm-up. We sat at the kitchen table and I put coffee in front of him and I said, "I'm not going to start. You called this time, Daniel. You start." He wrapped his hands around the mug and looked at the table for a long moment. And then he said something I had not prepared myself for. "I've been trying to figure out how to explain this in a way that doesn't sound like I'm making excuses," he said. "And I've realized I can't, because anything I say about why I did it is going to sound like an excuse. So I'm just going to say what's true and let you do what you want with it." I didn't say anything. Neither did Olivia. "The business is gone," he said. "Not almost gone. Gone. The Chicago firm's lawsuit is going to take whatever's left when it settles. My partners walked. My assistant took another job last week and I couldn't even be angry about it because I'd have done the same." He looked up from the mug. "And I sat in my office about 8 months ago looking at what was happening and I thought, The ranch. I thought about what it was worth and what it could fix, and I let myself go somewhere I should never have gone. You let yourself go there for 2 years, I said. You arranged forged documents, Daniel. You arranged a retirement facility. You photographed your father's car and listed it for sale. That's not a moment of bad judgment. That's a sustained campaign. I know. I want to hear you say that clearly, not I let myself go somewhere. Say what it actually was. He was quiet. His jaw worked. I could see him fighting something. Pride, maybe, or the particular resistance of a person who has spent their whole life being good at things and finds the language of failure almost physically difficult to produce. I committed fraud, he said finally. I forged documents to steal your property. And I arranged to have you removed from your home so I could complete the sale without you being able to stop me. He stopped. His voice had dropped to something barely above a murmur. I did all of that. The kitchen was very quiet. Thank you, I said. Olivia was looking at her father with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not soft, not entirely hard, something complicated and in motion. She said, "Did you think about what would happen to her? Like, actually think about it? Not the plan, not the logistics. Did you think about what it would be like for Grandma to be put in a facility?" Daniel looked at his daughter. Something in his face shifted in a way I hadn't seen before. Something cracked open. "No," he said. "I didn't. And I think that's the thing I'm most ashamed of. Not the legal part. The legal part I knew was wrong when I was doing it. But I just didn't let myself see her. I made her into an obstacle instead of a person, and He stopped, put his hand over his eyes for a moment. "I didn't let myself see you," he said to me now, "because if I had, I couldn't have done it." I want to tell you that this was the moment everything shifted and became something manageable. It wasn't. Because the thing about a real conversation, not a movie version, not a therapy session with a script version, but an actual conversation between actual people with actual years of accumulated history, is that one honest statement doesn't dissolve everything that came before it. It opens a door. It doesn't walk you through it. What came through that door in the 2 hours that followed was messy and painful, and at several points loud in ways I hadn't anticipated. The loudest moment came when Olivia, who had been holding herself together with a discipline that I recognized as costing her significantly, finally put down her coffee cup with more force than necessary and said, "You know what I keep coming back to, Dad? The car, not the documents. I understand fraud. I understand desperation. But you went into that barn, you moved the tarp, you took photographs of Grandpa's car, and you put a price on it. And you knew. You've always known what that car meant to this family." Olivia, no. Her voice was not raised, but it was absolute. "I need to say this. You grew up knowing that car was him, that Grandma couldn't even donate it to a museum somewhere because it was too much like giving away the last piece of him she had. You knew that and you listed it anyway, for $60,000. Like it was just inventory." She looked at him with those direct, serious eyes that didn't flinch from anything. "That's not desperation, Dad. That's contempt. And I need to understand whether you even see that." Daniel didn't answer immediately, and I noticed that he didn't reach for a defense, which was the thing I'd been watching for. The reflexive self-protection that had characterized every version of this conversation I'd run through in my head. He just sat with what she'd said. "I see it," he said finally. "I didn't let myself see it then. But I see it now." "Why? What changed?" He looked at his daughter for a long moment. "I found a photograph," he said, "in my apartment in Denver. Old one. I don't even know how it got in the drawer where I found it. It was me and Dad, in the barn, when I was maybe 12. I'm standing next to the Mustang, and he's got his hand on my shoulder, and we're both looking at the engine. I don't even remember that day." He paused. "I just sat there holding that photograph, and I thought, what did I do? What did I almost do?" Olivia looked at him for a long time. Then she looked away, out the window, and I watched her work through something privately, and I didn't interrupt it. Here's what I have to tell you about Daniel that I haven't fully told you yet, because I've been building a picture for you. The fraud, the documents, the facility brochure, the car. And that picture is true. Every part of it is true, but it is not complete. My son had carried something for a very long time. I knew that. I had known it in the vague, uncomfortable way that parents know things they haven't been able to fix. But sitting at that table on that gray October Saturday, I started to hear the shape of it more clearly than I ever had. He talked, haltingly, with long pauses, with the particular difficulty of a man dismantling something he's kept sealed for decades, about what it had been like to grow up on Silver Creek Ranch as Robert Hayes' son, about the way the ranch had always come first, about how Robert's best energy, his most present self, his deepest engagement, had always been for the land and the livestock and the machinery and the endless work of the place. And how Daniel, who had loved his father and wanted his father's attention in the ordinary way of children, had grown up feeling like he was always second to a piece of ground. "I'm not saying it's your fault," he said to me, "or Dad's. I know you both worked like that because you had to. I know the ranch needed what it needed. I'm not trying to make you responsible for what I did. I'm just trying to tell you where it came from." "When did it start feeling like the ranch was the enemy?" I asked. He thought about that. "I was about 14, he said. "There was a thing with the irrigation system that summer. Some pump failed, and it was a whole situation, and Dad was out there for 2 weeks straight barely sleeping, and I had a baseball tournament, state qualifier, and he missed all of it because of the pump. I remembered that summer. I remembered the pump, and I remembered the tournament, and I remembered the choice Robert had made, and how he'd felt about it, and how he'd never quite forgiven himself for it either. He felt terrible about missing that," I said. I know he did. But he still missed it." Daniel looked at his hands. "And I know I know grown men aren't supposed to still be hung up on a Little League tournament from 40 years ago. I know how it sounds. But that's when I started thinking of the ranch as the thing that took my father away from me. And once I started thinking of it that way, I never really stopped." Olivia had turned back from the window. She was watching her father with something that had shifted slightly from what I'd seen earlier. Still not forgiveness, still not absolution, but something more complicated. The look of someone encountering a piece of information that doesn't fit neatly into the framework they've been using. "You could have talked to someone," she said. "Like, ever, in 40 years. "Yeah," he said. "I could have." "Why didn't you?" A long silence. "Because I told myself I was over it. I told myself I'd moved on, built my own thing, didn't need any of it, and I believed that right up until I needed $8 million, and there was the ranch just sitting there." He exhaled. "Turns out I wasn't over anything." Tja. The conversation broke apart around 2 in the afternoon. Not badly. It just ran out of room, the way these things do when too much has been said, and everyone needs air. Olivia went out to check on the cattle, and I suspected she needed the solitude as much as the task. Daniel and I sat at the table a while longer, and eventually I got up and went to the window and looked out at the land. "I need to tell you what I've decided," I said. "Okay? I'm not pursuing criminal charges. Not immediately." I turned around to look at him. "That's not a pardon, Daniel. Everything Frank documented is preserved, and Carol has instructions about what to do with it if anything changes. You understand what I mean by that?" "Yes." "You're going to formally withdraw all claims to the property, any and all claims. Your attorneys are going to file paperwork that makes clear the ranch and everything on it belongs to me and, in the case of the North Ridge, to Olivia. You're going to put that in writing and sign it." "Yes," he said again. "You're going to return the deposit Meridian Land Group paid you, whatever advance they paid you toward the sale. All of it." He nodded. "And you're going to go to therapy." I said it plainly, without softening it. "Real therapy. Not twice and then stop. Regular ongoing therapy with someone who has experience with family systems and resentment that's been calcifying for 40 years. I'm not in a position to monitor that, and I'm not going to try, but I'm telling you it's what I think you need, and I'm asking you to take it seriously." He was quiet for a moment. "That's it?" "That's not nothing, Daniel." "No," he said quickly. "I know, I thought there would be more." "There might be more later," I said honestly. I don't know yet what more looks like. I'm not a woman who makes promises about things she can't see clearly. What I can tell you right now is that I'm not handing you to a prosecutor today, and that the door to something better than what we've had hasn't closed. That's all I'm prepared to say. He looked at me, really looked at me, the way he hadn't in years, without the performance layer, without the calculation. Just a 65-year-old man sitting in his mother's kitchen trying to see what was actually in front of him. Why? He said. Why what? Why not just let Carol file? You have everything you need. I couldn't fight it. Why give me any version of a chance? I thought about how to answer that. I thought about Pete Gallagher and Frank D'Souza and Carol Benton and Olivia and Robert's Mustang under its canvas tarp and the photograph Daniel had found in his apartment drawer. The 12-year-old boy standing next to the car with his father's hand on his shoulder, both of them looking at an engine, a day neither of them remembered. Because I spent 45 years building something on this land, I said. And what I built wasn't just acreage and cattle and a house. It was a family. A broken, difficult, imperfect family, but mine. And I'm 67 years old, and I'm not willing to end my life having handed the last piece of that family to a prosecutor when there's a chance, not a certainty, just a chance, that it doesn't have to end that way. He didn't say anything. Don't make me regret that, I said. That's the only other thing I'm asking. Don't make me regret it. He left around 3. I walked him out to his car and we stood in the cold for a moment and he said, Mom, I'm sorry. I know it doesn't fix anything. No, I said. It doesn't, but it's a place to start. He got in the car. I watched him go down the gravel road, and this time the dust that followed his car felt different than it had 3 weeks ago. Not resolved. Nothing was resolved. Not even close. The legal paperwork wasn't done. The therapy hadn't started. The full weight of what he'd done was still sitting on the table like something no one had quite figured out how to lift. But it felt different. Olivia came around the side of the barn and stood next to me, watching the dust settle. How are you feeling? She asked. Like I just carried something very heavy for a very long distance, I said. And I put it down, but I can still feel the weight of it in my arms. She nodded like she understood exactly what that meant. We stood there together in the October cold, on the land that was still ours, and after a while she said, I don't forgive him, not yet, maybe not for a long time. That's fair, I said, but I don't think I'm done with him either. That's also fair. The wind came up off the ridge and moved through the dry grass along the fence line, and somewhere in the south pasture the cattle shifted and settled, and the creek did what it always did, and Silver Creek Ranch breathed around us the way it had breathed for 45 years, steady and patient and indifferent to the particular human dramas being worked out on its surface. I put my arm around my granddaughter's shoulders. She leaned into me slightly. Just slightly. Enough. We went inside before the cold got worse, because there was dinner to make and tomorrow's work to plan and the ongoing ordinary business of a life that had been fought for and was still standing. The fight wasn't over, not by a long distance, but today at least we were still here. That had to be enough for now. And it was. The paperwork took 3 weeks. That's the part no one tells you about when you imagine these moments of reckoning. The aftermath isn't dramatic. It's documents and phone calls and attorneys billing by the hour and a great deal of waiting around for things to be filed and confirmed and stamped by people in county offices who have no idea what it costs to get to the point where a signature was possible. Carol managed most of it with her usual precision, and I stayed out of the details because I had learned over the course of that fall that there is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being too close to every moving part of your own crisis, and I needed to step back from it before it wore me down to something I couldn't recover from quickly. Daniel signed everything Carol put in front of him. I want to give him that. He did not stall, did not find last-minute technical objections, did not let his attorneys talk him into one more delay. He signed the withdrawal of all property claims on a Wednesday morning in Carol's Missoula office, with me present and Olivia sitting beside me, and when it was done, he looked across the conference table at his daughter and said, I know this doesn't fix it. Olivia looked at the signed papers on the table and then at her father. No, she said, But it's the first honest thing you've done in 2 years, so. Carol, to her credit, said nothing and kept her face professionally neutral. The Meridian Land Group situation was messier. The company's representatives were not pleased about the deal collapsing, and there was a period of several weeks during which their attorneys sent letters suggesting Daniel bore personal liability for the failed transaction. Carol handled that correspondence without involving me in the specifics, which I was grateful for. What I understood was that Daniel ultimately settled with them for an amount that represented most of what little liquid cash he had left after the Chicago lawsuit had begun its work on his accounts. He told me about it in a phone call in mid-November, the flat, matter-of-fact tone of a man reporting damage he'd already absorbed. "How much do you have left?" I asked. "Enough for maybe 3 months of basic expenses if I'm careful," he said. "After that, I don't know." I sat with that for a moment. "Are you in Missoula or Denver?" "Missoula. I haven't gone back to Denver." A pause. "There's nothing to go back for." I hadn't known he was still in Montana. That surprised me. And then it didn't, because when you've lost everything in a place, the energy required to return to that place and face the wreckage is sometimes more than a person can generate on their own. Montana was neutral ground. Montana was where his mother was. "Are you eating?" I asked. It was a ridiculous question in one sense. He was 65 years old, not a child who needed reminding. But it came out of me before I could filter it, because he was my child regardless of how old he was or what he had done, and the question of whether he was eating was a real one. A short silence on his end, then quietly, "Yeah, Mom, I'm eating." "Okay," I said. "I'll call you next week." The therapy was his own finding. I hadn't specified who or where, just that it needed to happen. And I hadn't asked him to report to me on it because I'm not his parole officer, and that's not a dynamic I wanted to create. But he told me about it voluntarily in late November. A therapist in Missoula named Dr. Wren, who worked primarily with men dealing with what she called legacy grief, which was apparently a term for the particular kind of damage that gets passed down through families without anyone fully understanding they're passing it. "Legacy grief," I repeated. "The idea is that some of what I carried wasn't originally mine," he said. "Like, Dad lost his father young, and he dealt with that by burying himself in work. And I grew up watching that and learning that's how men handle loss, which meant I never actually handled anything. I just kept moving until I ran out of road." I thought about Robert, about the way he'd worked, the ferocious relentlessness of it, which I had always understood as love. Love for the land, love for the family, love expressed through the only language he'd ever been fully fluent in. I had never thought about what he'd been running from while he ran toward all of that. "Your father had a hard childhood," I said carefully. "He didn't talk about it much." "I know, that's kind of the point." This was not a comfortable conversation. It was the kind of conversation that requires you to hold two things at once: your grief for a man you loved, and the emerging, unwelcome understanding that some of the shadows that man carried had fallen on people who didn't deserve to stand in them. I had loved Robert Hayes with my whole self for 40 years. I was not willing to reduce him to his damage, but I was also not going to pretend, in the interest of protecting his memory, that the damage hadn't existed. "Is it helping?" I asked. "The therapy." "I don't know yet," Daniel said. "It mostly just makes me feel worse for an hour and then slightly less like I'm completely underwater for the rest of the day. Dr. Wren says that's normal." "That does sound like how it's supposed to work." "Yeah." A pause. "She wants to do a family session eventually, with you and Olivia, if you'd be willing. I told her I'd ask, but that I wasn't going to push it." I was quiet for a moment. The request sat on me in an uncomfortable way. Not because I was opposed to it in principle, but because the idea of sitting in a therapist's office with my son felt like an exposure I hadn't prepared for. I had spent 67 years being the woman who handled things, who kept herself together, who made the decisions and held the ground and got through what needed getting through. The idea of unpacking any of that in a structured setting with a professional watching felt foreign in a way that was difficult to articulate. "Let me think about it," I said. "That's all I'm asking." Cheto. Olivia went back to Bozeman in December. She'd stayed at the ranch for 6 weeks, which was longer than either of us had originally anticipated, and which had changed something between us, deepened it in a way that I suspected would be permanent. Before she left, she sat with me at the kitchen table one evening, and we talked about the ranch's future in concrete terms for the first time. She wanted to come back after graduation. Not visit, come back. She had ideas about expanding the operation in a direction that honored the land rather than extracting from it. Sustainable grazing practices, potentially some agritourism, a connection with the university's agriculture program that she'd been thinking about since her first semester. She laid it out carefully, watching my face for signs that I was dismissing it, ready to defend any piece of it that needed defending. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since I was about 14, she said. "I just didn't think it was mine to think about." "It's always been yours," I said. "I need you to know that. Long before I put your name on the deed to the North Ridge, this place was always going to be yours. I just didn't say it clearly enough." She looked at me in a way that I recognized as her trying not to cry, and not quite succeeding, which made two of us. "Grandma," she said. "Don't," I said, "or we'll both be useless." She laughed, which was the right response, and we both composed ourselves, and then we talked for another 2 hours about cattle rotations and water rights and the condition of the North Ridge cottage and what it would take to make it livable, which was a more grounded and useful conversation and left us both feeling better than we had at the start of it. She left the next morning. I watched her blue truck go down the gravel road, and I stood on the porch in the December cold until I couldn't see it anymore. And then I went back inside, and the house was very large and very quiet, and I sat with that for a while before I got up and found something to do. The call that I hadn't been expecting came on a Tuesday in January. It was Carol. She didn't lead with pleasantries, which was how I knew immediately that the call had weight. "Margaret, I need to tell you something that came across my desk this morning, and I want you to hear it from me before you hear it from anyone else." "All right," I said. "The county prosecutor's office has received information about the forged documents. Not from us, from Meridian Land Group's attorneys, who apparently decided that pursuing Daniel for the failed deal meant establishing on the record that fraud had been committed. They submitted Frank's findings as part of their own civil case, and the prosecutor's office is now aware of what was done." I sat down. "Meaning they could proceed regardless of whether I asked them to?" "Meaning exactly that," Carol said. "Criminal fraud doesn't require the victim's cooperation to prosecute. If the prosecutor decides there's sufficient evidence, and Margaret, there is sufficient evidence, they can move forward on their own initiative." The room felt very still. "What are the chances they proceed?" I asked. "I spoke with someone I know in the office this morning, informally. They haven't made a decision, but the fact that Daniel has signed the withdrawal of claims and returned the Meridian deposit will factor in. It demonstrates some degree of remediation. It's not nothing, but it's also not a guarantee." "What do I need to do?" "Nothing right now, but I think you should call Daniel and tell him before he finds out another way. And I think, and this is my professional opinion, Margaret, not pressure, you should consider whether there's anything you want to say to the prosecutor's office about the remediation steps Daniel has taken. You have standing to speak to that. You won't be able to stop a prosecution if they decide to pursue it, but your perspective carries weight." After I hung up with Carol, I sat at the roll-top desk for a long time. I looked at the locked drawer where the documents had been moved, where someone had replaced the deed upside down and everything had begun. And I thought about what it meant to be the person who held the weight of a decision that had consequences in every direction. I called Daniel. He picked up on the second ring. "The county prosecutor's office knows about the documents," I said. "Meridian's attorneys submitted Frank's findings. It's out of my hands now in terms of whether it stays just between us." The silence on his end was long enough that I checked the phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Daniel." "I'm here." His voice was stripped of everything, just the bare words. "Okay. Are you understanding what I'm telling you?" "Yes, I'm understanding." A pause. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to speak to the prosecutor's office about what you've done since October. The withdrawal, the Meridian settlement, the therapy. I'm going to tell them the truth about all of it and let them make their decision." I stopped. "I can't protect you from the consequences of what you did, Daniel. I'm not able to do that, and I wouldn't be doing you any favors if I tried. What I can do is make sure they have the complete picture." He was quiet for so long that when he finally spoke, it startled me. "Mom," he said, "I need to tell you something. Something I haven't said yet because I didn't know how." "Then say it." Another pause. I heard him breathing, heard the particular cadence of someone gathering themselves for something that doesn't come easily. In the sessions with Dr. Wren, she's been asking me to trace things back, where decisions came from, what I was actually feeling when I made them. And there's something I've been circling around for 2 months that I finally said out loud last week. He stopped. When I was making the plan, when I was arranging everything, the documents, the sale, the facility, I kept telling myself it was about the money, the business, the debt, saving everything I'd built. But there was something else underneath it, something I didn't want to look at. What was it? "I wanted to take it from you," he said, and his voice when he said it was the most honest I'd ever heard it, raw in the way of something that has been kept underwater for too long and finally broken the surface. Not just sell it, take it. I needed to prove that I could, that I had the power to do that, because I'd spent my whole life feeling like that ranch had more of my parents than I did, and some part of me wanted to win, even if winning meant destroying everything. He stopped. That's the part I'm most ashamed of, not the fraud, not even the facility. The fact that part of me wanted to hurt you, because you loved this place and I was angry at you for it. I didn't say anything for a moment. Outside the window, the January land was gray and frozen and absolutely still. The creek was running slow under a skim of ice at the edges. The equipment barn sat solid and unchanged in the middle distance. "Thank you for telling me that," I said finally. "I know it doesn't—" "Daniel," I stopped him. "I heard you. I'm not going to minimize what you just said, and I'm not going to tell you it's fine. It's not fine. But I heard it. And the fact that you can say it, the fact that you're in a room with someone every week making yourself look at these things, that matters to me. It doesn't undo anything. But it matters." A long, unsteady exhale on his end. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll call you after I speak with Carol about the prosecutor's office." Cool. The family therapy session happened in February. I want to be honest with you about it. I hated the first 45 minutes. Sitting in Dr. Wren's office, a woman in her 50s with a calm that I initially found irritating before I understood that it was a professional tool rather than a personal affect, being asked to describe my relationship with my son in terms of its history, rather than its recent crisis, felt like being asked to dismantle something while still needing it to hold weight. I said less than I wanted to and more than I intended. At one point, I said something about Robert that surprised me when it came out of my mouth. Something about how I had always known he wasn't fully present with Daniel in the way Daniel needed, and I had told myself it would sort itself out when Daniel was older, and it never did, and I had carried some guilt about that for years without ever naming it clearly. Dr. Wren didn't respond to that the way I expected. She didn't reflect it back or make it into a teachable moment. She just looked at me and said, "That must have been lonely," knowing and not knowing what to do with it. I didn't answer her, but something in my chest moved in a way I hadn't expected. Olivia drove down from Bozeman for the session. She sat between her father and me, and she said hard things to Daniel that needed saying, and she said them with a precision and fairness that made me proud in a complicated, bittersweet way. Proud that she was her own person, capable of holding someone accountable without cruelty, and sad that she'd had to develop that skill as young as she had, and in this particular context. At one point, Daniel looked at his daughter and said, "I know I wasn't the father you deserved." And Olivia said without hesitating, "No, you weren't, but I'm still here. So figure out what that means and do something with it." Dr. Wren said that was a good place to stop for the day. In March, the prosecutor's office informed Carol that they would not be filing criminal charges at this time, citing the remediation steps taken and the victim's statement regarding her son's subsequent conduct. Carol called me with the news on a Thursday morning. "Not a permanent closure," she said. "If anything changes, if he violates the withdrawal agreement, if anything new comes to light, the file stays open." Understood. "How are you feeling about it?" I looked out the window at the March land, which was starting to think about spring without quite committing to it yet. Snow still on the high ground, but the south-facing slopes showing the first pale green of new growth. The creek was running full and clear. Relieved, I said. Not because he avoided punishment, because I'm not going to spend the next several years watching my son go through a criminal trial. There's a difference. There is, Carol said. What's next for you? I thought about Olivia's plans, about the North Ridge cottage and what it would take to make it livable, and the conversation we'd had about agritourism and the university connection and the sustainable grazing rotation she'd been mapping out in her notebooks. I thought about the family session and Dr. Wren's office and Daniel's voice saying I wanted to take it from you, and what it had cost him to say that, and what it was going to cost him to keep being a person who could say things like that. I thought about a decision I had been sitting with since January, one I hadn't told anyone about yet because I hadn't been certain enough to say it out loud. There's something I need to talk to Daniel about, I said. I'll fill you in if it becomes something legal. I called him that same evening. The prosecutor isn't filing, I said, when he picked up. Another long silence. Margaret, don't, I said. Thank me later or don't thank me at all. Right now I need to talk to you about something else. Okay. The cottage on the North Ridge, I said. It needs work. The roof needs attention. The plumbing hasn't been used in years. And someone would need to put real time and effort into making it livable. I paused. I'm not offering it to you because I've forgiven you everything. I want to be very clear about that. I'm offering it because you have nowhere to go and nothing left, and you're my son, and this land is where our family has always come to either fall apart or put itself back together. And I would rather watch you try to put yourself back together where I can see it than have you disappear somewhere and find out in 6 months that you've stopped trying. The silence on his end this time was different from all the other silences. There was something in it that I hadn't heard from my son in, I couldn't remember how long. Something young, something that sounded like the boy in the photograph in the barn, standing next to his father's car. You'd have to earn your keep, I said, before he could find words. There's real work here. The spring fence line needs 2 weeks of attention minimum. The irrigation system wants a full inspection before we need it. Olivia has ideas about the operation that are going to need physical labor to implement, and I can't do all of it alone. Mom? His voice was barely there. Why are you doing this? Because your father would have, I said simply. And because I am not willing to let what you did define everything that comes after it. I'm not willing to do that to myself, and I'm not willing to do it to you. He didn't say anything for a long time. And then he said, in a voice I hadn't heard in 40 years, okay, I'll come. There are conditions, I said. Written ones. Carol will draw them up. I know. And Daniel, the first time you make me regret this, it's done. I mean that. I know, he said again. Good. I looked out at the dark Montana night, at the stars that were sharp and cold over the ridgeline. Come on Sunday, I'll have the heat on in the cottage. I put the phone down. I sat in the quiet for a while. Then I got up because there was a list to make and a roof to arrange an inspection on and a son coming home to a place that wasn't quite home yet and might never be completely, but was still standing, still solid, still here. Some things you have to start before you can see where they're going. I had learned that the first time I stood on a ridge at 22 and cried for reasons I couldn't name, looking down at a creek winding through a valley that felt ancient and already ours. I still believed it. Daniel arrived on a Sunday with 2 bags and a box of tools, not much else. That was the entirety of what remained of a life he had spent 30 years building in Denver. 2 canvas duffel bags that fit in the back seat of his car, and a metal toolbox that had belonged to Robert, which Daniel had taken with him to college and apparently kept through every apartment and office and version of himself since then. I noticed the toolbox immediately when he carried it up the cottage steps. I recognized it before I recognized half of what was in the bags. I didn't say anything about it, but I noticed. The cottage needed more work than I'd initially let on when I offered it to him. The roof inspection had revealed 2 sections of damaged shingles that Dale's nephew had patched in November. But the interior was cold in a way that went beyond the season. Cold the way spaces get when they've been empty long enough to forget what warmth feels like. The plumbing groaned when we ran the water for the first time, and the kitchen faucet dripped steadily for 2 days before Daniel figured out what needed replacing and fixed it himself, lying on his back under the sink with Robert's toolbox open beside him. I brought him dinner that first week. Not every night. I was not going to become his housekeeper, and I think we both understood instinctively that a certain distance was necessary, that proximity without boundaries would collapse whatever fragile structure we were trying to build. But a few times. Soup mostly, because it was still cold and soup was practical, and it gave us something to do with our hands while we talked. The talking was slow, not hostile. We were past hostility, or at least past the acute version of it, but slow in the way of two people who had been speaking past each other for decades and were now trying to learn a different kind of conversation. We were awkward with each other in ways that were almost ordinary, the awkward of a mother and adult son who don't quite know how to be in the same room without the armor of occasion or agenda. It was uncomfortable. It was also, in a strange way, more honest than anything we'd managed in years, because there was no performance left. He had nothing to perform, and I had nothing to protect, and what was left when you stripped all of that away was just two people sitting at a small kitchen table in a cold cottage trying to figure out if there was something worth salvaging between them. Some evenings there was. Some evenings we sat in silence that went on too long, and I'd leave and walk back down to the main house in the dark, feeling like we'd failed some test I hadn't known we were taking. Those evenings I'd go in and sit at Robert's desk for a while, not doing anything in particular, just being near the wood and the old leather smell and the particular quiet of that room which had held so much over so many years. Spring came the way it always does in Montana, slowly and then all at once. Olivia drove up from Bozeman on a Friday in April, unannounced the way she'd arrived in October, and this time she brought two classmates from her environmental science program who wanted to see the property as part of a project she was developing on sustainable grazing practices. She called me from an hour out to tell me they were coming, which I appreciated even if it wasn't quite the same as asking. "I should have called earlier," she said. "Yes," I said. "Are you annoyed?" "A little. Come anyway." They arrived mid-afternoon, Olivia and two young women named Priya and Sam, who had the particular energy of people who are deeply interested in something and not at all self-conscious about showing it. They walked the south pasture for 2 hours with notebooks and measuring equipment and a level of enthusiasm for soil composition that I found genuinely refreshing, because enthusiasm for the land in any form is something I have always responded to. Daniel came down from the cottage that afternoon. I hadn't arranged it. He'd simply seen the truck and come to see what was happening. He stood at the edge of the south pasture watching the three of them work, and Olivia noticed him after a few minutes and said something to her friends and then walked over to where he was standing. I was too far away to hear what they said. I watched from the porch, watched my son and my granddaughter standing at the fence line in the April light, talking. It went on for maybe 10 minutes. At one point, Olivia gestured out toward the north ridge, pointing at something, and Daniel nodded. At another point, he said something that made her look at him sharply, and then after a moment nod once. When she came back, she walked past me into the house without stopping, and I followed her to the kitchen. "What did you talk about?" I asked. She poured herself a glass of water. He apologized. Again. A real one this time. Not like the ones in October where he was still partially in crisis mode. A real, thought-out apology. She drank. He said he'd been working on what to say to me specifically for about 3 weeks. And? And it was the right things. Which is, I don't know. It's not nothing. She set down the glass and looked out the kitchen window toward where Daniel was still standing at the fence line. It's still not enough, but it's not nothing. That's where we live now, I said, in the territory between not nothing and not enough. That's just where we are. She looked at me. Is that okay? For you? I thought about it honestly. It's what's true, I said. Whether it's okay is a different question, and I think the answer changes from day to day. She nodded slowly. Yeah, she said. Okay, yeah. Dumb. What happened over the following months was not a transformation. I want to be careful about that word, transformation, because it implies a before and after with a clean line between them, and that is not what I witnessed or lived. What I witnessed was something messier and slower and more like geological change than anything dramatic. the kind of change that happens in the ground, down deep, where you can't see it, but you can eventually feel it in the way the surface holds. Daniel worked the ranch. That's the simplest way to say it. He got up in the mornings, and he did what needed doing. And some days that was fence line, and some days it was irrigation, and some days it was moving cattle between pastures with Dale, who, to his credit, treated Daniel with a watchful neutrality that was both appropriate and clearly the result of a man choosing his behavior very deliberately. Dale had known our family for 20 years. He didn't say anything to me about it directly, but one morning he came into the barn while I was checking on a heifer, and he said, "Your boy works hard." "He always could when he wanted to," I said. Dale considered that. "Seems like he wants to now." "Seems like," I said. That was all Dale said about it. But it mattered that he said it at all. The thing about physical labor, real labor, the kind that asks something of your body and your attention over the course of a full day, is that it does something to your thinking that nothing else quite replicates. I'd known that my whole life, but had never thought about it as something Daniel lacked. He'd been a desk man for 30 years. He'd built his adult identity around meetings and deals and the leverage of professional knowledge, and all of that had collapsed. And now he was on his knees in a pasture, checking the connections on an irrigation line with mud on his hands and his back aching and the sky going orange over the western ridge. I found him out there one evening, later than he should have still been working. He didn't hear me coming, and I stood watching him for a moment before I said anything. He was working carefully, methodically, the way Robert had worked. That specific focus of a man who has decided that the thing in front of him deserves his full attention. "You should stop for the night," I said. He looked up. "Almost done with this section." "It'll keep until morning." "I know, I want to finish it." I stood there for a moment in the early evening quiet. The creek sound was clear from where we were. Somewhere behind us, a nighthawk was calling. "Your father used to do exactly that," I said. "Stay out past dark on a thing because he'd decided it needed to be done today." Daniel looked up at me. His face in the fading light was my father-in-law's face and Robert's face, and something distinctly his own all at once. And I was 67 years old, and I had loved and lost and fought and held, and I was standing in my pasture at dusk watching my son learn something about himself. And it hurt, and it was good, and it was real, in a way that very few things in my life had ever been so completely real. "Did it bother you?" he asked. "When he did that?" "Sometimes," I said honestly. "And sometimes I'd bring him coffee and just be glad he was still here to be out in the field too late." Daniel looked back down at the irrigation connection in his hands. "I wish I'd understood him better," he said, "when I had the chance." "You might understand him better now than you would have then," I said. "That's not nothing." He didn't respond to that, but he nodded once, slightly, and I walked back to the house in the last of the light. The session with Dr. Wren in May was the fourth family session, and it was the one where something finally cracked open that had been sealed for longer than I could track. We had been working through, session by session, the architecture of our family. Not just the recent crisis, but the decades that had built the conditions for it. It was slow and often uncomfortable and required me to say things out loud that I had spent years keeping neatly filed away in the category of things that happened and cannot be changed, so there's no use dwelling on them. Dr. Wren was methodical about dismantling that category without making me feel like I was being dismantled along with it, which I respected professionally, even when I found it personally exhausting. In the May session, she asked me something she hadn't asked before. She asked me what I had needed from Daniel over the years that I hadn't received. I started to say nothing, the reflexive answer of a woman who has spent 67 years being the one who provides rather than the one who receives. Dr. Wren waited. She was very good at waiting. What came out, after a silence that went on long enough to be uncomfortable, was this. I had needed him to love this place. Not for practical reasons, not because I needed help running it, or a successor willing to take it on, but because the ranch was the most complete expression of my life's meaning, and I had wanted the person I loved most, my child, to see that, to recognize it, to care about it the way I cared about it. And he never had, and I had known that for 30 years. And I had never said it to him directly because saying it felt like asking for something a person shouldn't have to ask for, and because I was afraid of what it would mean if I asked, and the answer was still no. The room was very quiet when I finished saying that. Daniel was looking at me in a way I hadn't seen since he was very small. "Mom," he said, and then he stopped, started again. "I didn't know you needed that. I think I always assumed the ranch was enough for you, that it gave you what you needed, and I was—" He stopped again, seemed to be struggling with something. "I think I told myself you didn't need me here because it was easier than admitting I didn't want to be." "I know," I said. "I let you tell yourself that. That's not on you." "Some of it is," I said. "I'm not good at asking for things. I never have been. Your father wasn't either. We were very well matched in that particular failing." Daniel made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in that direction. "Great. Generational damage of the emotionally self-sufficient." "Something like that," I said. Dr. Wren let the moment breathe. Then she said, "What would it look like going forward to change that pattern, specifically and practically?" It was a simple question. It was also the kind of question that opens a door into a hallway you hadn't known existed, and I sat with it for a long moment. "It would look like me telling my son when I need something," I said, "and it would look like him staying close enough to be told." I looked at Daniel when I said it. He held my gaze. "Okay," he said. "I can do that." Olivia graduated in May. We were both there. Daniel and I sitting together in the bleachers of a university field in Bozeman on a clear Saturday afternoon, watching my granddaughter walk across a stage in a cap and gown to collect a degree in environmental science. She was 23 years old, and she had the bearing of someone who knew exactly where she was going, which was something I had recognized in her since she was a girl, but which was striking in a new way now, because where she was going was real and specific, and she had made it so herself. Daniel clapped when her name was called. Long, sustained, the kind of clapping that has emotion in it. Afterward, at the dinner Olivia had chosen, a place in Bozeman that she liked, nothing fancy, the kind of restaurant where the tables are a little too close together and the noise level makes you lean in to hear each other. The three of us sat and ate and talked for 3 hours. Not about the ranch or the legal situation or the sessions with Dr. Wren. Just talked. About Olivia's plans, which were concrete and exciting and would require more work than she was probably fully accounting for, which I told her directly. About a road trip she wanted to take before settling back at Silver Creek in August. About a book she'd read and a podcast Daniel had been listening to. And at one point, about a memory of Robert, something Daniel brought up unprompted. A specific afternoon when he was 8 years old and Robert had taught him to change a tire on the gravel road. And how Robert had made him do it 3 times until he could do it without being told each step, and how furious 8-year-old Daniel had been, and how later, driving alone to college, he'd gotten a flat on the highway and changed it in the rain in 12 minutes, and felt, for a moment, entirely capable. Olivia listened to that story with her chin in her hand and her eyes bright, and when Daniel finished, she said, "That's a really good story about him." "I have a few," Daniel said. "I mostly forgot I had them." "Tell me another one," she said. And he did. And that, I think, was the thing I hadn't known to hope for. That my son would one day sit across from his daughter and tell her stories about her grandfather that he'd been carrying without knowing it, locked away in the same place where the resentment had lived, and that the stories would be good ones, true ones, the kind that let a man who has been dead for 11 years stay a little bit alive in the people who came from him. I didn't say much during that part of the evening. I just sat there and listened and thought about time, about how long things take, and how much damage can accumulate in the years when the wrong things go unsaid, and how the right things, when they finally come, sometimes come in the most ordinary of moments. Not in a therapist's office or a kitchen table confrontation or a legal document. At dinner, over food that's getting cold because nobody can stop talking. I want to tell you where we are now, not where we will be. I'm 67 years old and I have the pragmatism of someone who has been surprised enough times to stop making confident predictions. But where we are now, in the plain terms of what is true. The ranch is protected. The conservation easement is permanent and ironclad, and not 1 acre of Silver Creek will be commercially developed in my lifetime, or Olivia's or her children's if she has them. That is done. That is settled. I feel something every time I think about it that I can only describe as the specific relief of a thing you fought for being finally, genuinely secure. Olivia came back to Silver Creek in August as planned. She brought her notebooks and her ideas and her 2 classmates for 3 weeks of what she was calling a pilot assessment, walking the property systematically, mapping the soil conditions and the water patterns, and the grazing rotation potential with the thoroughness of someone who intends to do this right rather than fast. She moved into the main house, her room, the one she'd always used as a child, and we established, without negotiating it explicitly, a rhythm that worked for both of us. She was up early and out on the land by 7 most mornings. I made coffee. Sometimes we talked over breakfast and sometimes we didn't need to. It was comfortable in a way that felt earned. Daniel is in the cottage on the North Ridge. He has been there since March. The roof holds. The plumbing no longer groans. He painted the interior over 2 weekends in June and replaced a section of flooring that had gone soft near the back door, and he did all of it himself, with Robert's toolbox and YouTube tutorials and one call to Dale's nephew when the flooring got complicated. It is not a beautiful cottage, but it is livable and it is his for as long as he does what he agreed to do, which he has. So far. He is still seeing Dr. Wren, monthly now instead of weekly, which she indicated was appropriate for where he was in the process. He told me about a session in July where he'd talked about the photograph, the one from the drawer, the 12-year-old boy and his father, and the Mustang. He said Dr. Wren had asked him what he wanted to say to that boy now, if he could. He said he'd told that boy, "You're going to spend a lot of years being angry at the wrong things. Try to figure out earlier what you're actually angry at. It'll save everyone a lot of grief." I thought about that for a long time after he told me. The Mustang is still in the barn, still under the canvas. I have not decided what to do about it, and I'm not in a hurry to decide. One afternoon in July, Daniel came into the barn when I was in there, sitting in the driver's seat the way I sometimes do, the way that probably looked strange to anyone who didn't understand what the car meant. And he pulled up a hay bale and sat near it, and we just stayed there for a while without talking. After about 15 minutes, he said, "Can I sit in it?" I got out and let him sit in the driver's seat. He put his hands on the wheel and looked at the dashboard for a while. Then he said, "He would have hated what I did." "Yes," I said, "he would have." And then he would have shown up with his toolbox and helped fix whatever needed fixing. I looked at my son sitting in his father's car with his hands on the wheel his father had restored, and I thought, yes, that is exactly what Robert would have done, because that was the language Robert spoke when words weren't enough. He showed up with his hands and he fixed things, and that was how he said the things he didn't know how to say any other way. I thought about a son who never fully learned to read that language until it was almost too late. And I thought about the fact that he was here now, on the land, with the toolbox, trying. "Yeah," I said quietly. "He would have. No, I told you at the beginning that the worst day of my life was the day my son handed me an envelope of cash and told me to disappear. I want to add something to that now, having lived through what came after. The worst day of my life was also the beginning of something I didn't know I needed. Not the fraud. The fraud was just destruction. There's nothing redemptive in what Daniel planned, but the fight that came after it. The weeks of building the legal case with Carol and Frank, the conversation with Olivia at midnight when she said, "I'm with you," without hesitating. The moment I stood in the barn after Daniel left the first time and put my hands on Robert's steering wheel and said, "I've got it." I needed to fight for this place. I had held it and worked it and loved it for 45 years, but I'd never had to fight for it the way I fought for it that fall. And something about that fight, something about being 67 years old and having to prove to yourself that you are still capable of strategic thought, of assembling allies, of holding your ground under the kind of pressure that would have broken some people, did something to me that I am still understanding. It reminded me who I was. And here's what I want to say to you. Because I promised myself at the beginning of this story that I would tell it honestly, not just the events, but the meaning underneath them. I want to say it clearly. If someone is trying to take something from you, your property, your dignity, your right to make decisions about your own life, it does not matter how much you love them. Love is not a reason to stand still while someone dismantles everything you built. Love is not a reason to sign documents you don't understand or move into a room someone else picked out for you or accept that the person who ought to protect you has decided you are an inconvenience to be managed. You have the right to protect yourself, even from family, especially from family, because family is where we are most vulnerable and where the people who would exploit that vulnerability know exactly where to press. I am 67 years old. I ran a 400-acre ranch alone for 11 years after my husband died. I was not foolish, and I was not frail, and I was not finished, and neither are you, whatever age you are and whatever someone in your life is trying to make you believe about your own limitations. The second thing I want to say is this: boundaries are not cruelty. Letting my son face real consequences, the loss of his business, the legal jeopardy, the public collapse of everything he'd built on a foundation of desperation and bad choices, was not cruelty on my part. I did not engineer those consequences. I simply declined to protect him from them. There is a difference, and it matters, and I had to learn it the hard way myself over the course of months, sitting with the discomfort of watching my child suffer and choosing not to reach in and absorb that suffering for him. Protecting the people you love sometimes means letting them stand in the full weight of what they've done. Because a person who is protected from all consequence learns nothing. They just wait for the next opportunity. And the third thing, the one that costs me the most to say, because it goes against the story I had been telling myself for years without fully realizing it, is that love without words is not always enough. Robert loved this family. I never doubted that for a moment. But Robert put his love into the land and the work and the endless driving effort of building something that would last. And he did not put enough of it into the room where his son was sitting, wondering if he mattered. I did not put enough of it there either, because I saw what Robert was doing, and I loved him for it. And I thought the ranch itself, what it represented, what it would one day become, would communicate everything that needed to be communicated. It didn't. And the person who paid the highest price for that silence was the boy who grew up feeling like he was second to a piece of ground. I'm not letting Daniel off the hook. What he did was his choice, but I'm saying that families pass things forward without meaning to. Wounds and silences and ways of loving that don't quite land. And sometimes the damage accumulates for 40 years before someone can name it. Sometimes it takes a crisis that terrible to force the naming. We are naming it now. Slowly, imperfectly, in the way of people who are better with land and labor than with words, but naming it. That has to count for something. Last week, Olivia found something in the barn. She was reorganizing the storage section, making room for some equipment she's bringing in for the grazing project. And she found, behind an old shelf unit, a box of Robert's that neither of us had known was there. Notebooks, mostly. His field notebooks from the early years of the ranch. Careful, precise records of soil conditions and crop rotations and cattle counts. His handwriting small and regular and completely characteristic. And underneath the notebooks, wrapped in a piece of old canvas, a photograph. She brought it to me at the kitchen table. It was a photograph I had never seen. Robert and I, young, I was maybe 23, which would make it the second year on the ranch. We were standing at the top of the first ridge, the one where I'd stood on the day we arrived and cried for reasons I couldn't name. Robert had his arm around my shoulders, and I was looking out at the land, and he was looking at me. And the expression on his face was the kind that people wear when they are looking at something they cannot believe they get to have. I sat with that photograph for a long time. Then I took it to the barn, and I propped it against the base of the Mustang, leaning against the wheel on the driver's side, under the canvas, where it would be the first thing you'd see if you lifted the cover and looked. I don't know why I put it there exactly. Something about wanting him to be present in the places that mattered most. Something about refusing to let the last story told about that car be the one where his son tried to sell it for $60,000. That afternoon, Daniel came into the barn for something, and he lifted the canvas to check a loose trim piece on the driver's door that he'd been meaning to look at, and he found the photograph. He came to the house about 20 minutes later. He didn't say much. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and looked at me, and then he said, "Thank you." "Don't mention it," I said. He nodded once, and he went back out. The land was doing what it always does, holding us all, asking nothing in return, keeping its long patience regardless of what we manage to figure out on its surface. Silver Creek running clear over its stones, the North Ridge going gold in the late afternoon, the cattle moving slow through the south pasture in the way cattle have moved through that pasture for 40 years, my granddaughter's truck parked in the yard, my son's light on in the cottage on the ridge, my husband's photograph tucked against the wheel of a car that is still, after everything, exactly where it belongs. This is not a perfect ending. I told you at the start that I am not a woman given to perfect endings, and I meant it. There are things between Daniel and me that may never fully heal. There are conversations Olivia and her father still need to have that they haven't been able to get to yet. There are mornings when I wake up and the anger is still there. Not as sharp as it was, but present. The way old injuries are present in cold weather. A reminder that something happened here that cannot be entirely undone. But the ranch is standing. The land is protected. The people I love most are close enough to reach. And I am still here, on the ground I have given my life to, doing the work that needs doing. For a woman of 67 who spent a fall fighting for everything she had, that is more than enough. That is everything.